Hey everyone, wanted to make a video to outline the class for today over project management. I apologize for not being able to be there in person, but essentially IT project management, as you can see here, is one of the top IT skills that are in demand. So there's a lot of others. You can see the ones in red are some of the ones we cover in this class. Some of them we'll already covered, some of them we'll cover in the future. But there's a lot of IT skills out there. This is one of the most highly demanded. So you can see there some of the information about the salaries for it. Just understand that this number is across the nation, and it also is going to be dealing with a pretty wide range of different jobs and experience levels and stuff like that. Also, Glassdoor has the number a little bit lower than that, so that could change things as well. But that said, project management can definitely be a great job to be in. So there's a lot of great opportunities out there for it, and just a really interesting thing in general. So let's talk about what a project is. So what a project is, it is something that has a begin and an end date. And we've talked about business processes before in this class. And the difference with a business process and a project, because it's easy to get the two confused. They sound similar, they're both done in business. They can be confused kind of easily. A process is something that's done repeatedly. Like payroll, like order procurement, order fulfillment. Those are things that you do over and over and over. Whereas a project is more like a one-off thing. You do it, once it's complete, it's done. You don't do it again. So it's got a start and an end date. And the goal is typically to make something unique and novel. So we have a project manager who their role is pretty much to take all of the skills and knowledge and really just help the project sort of move along and meet the needs of the business. So some IT projects that we typically see are things like rolling out a new software update, maybe rolling out some new hardware, making a new app like you're doing in this class. You're making a mobile app, or at least you're sort of building a business idea around making a mobile app. So deploying some sort of enterprise-wide system would be a great example of one. Maybe deploying a new phone system. There's all sorts of possibilities. It's just using any sort of technology throughout the organization. That's an IT project. So we think back to the example we had from Shark Tank. So their IT project was they wanted a new website. And that's an example of an IT project. It's a new website, and they were warned not to update it because it's risky. So we talk about that risk a little bit, and I'm going to throw this statistic at you. I think it's important to understand this. It is estimated that between 3 out of 4 and 9 out of 10 IT projects will fail. That's a pretty staggering number when you think about it. So between 3 out of 4 and 9 out of 10 IT projects will fail. That's really shockingly high. Okay, and we think about some of the reasons for that. There's two primary types of failure. Okay, so one of the failures is execution. And that's going to be dealing with the execution. Either you're over budget, it was delivered late, or it doesn't have the quality that it needs, or you have a business failure. So a business failure is going to be where you essentially don't meet the business needs with the project. So that's very easy to do because we think about execution failures in particular. If you're 1 day late, it's considered an execution failure. If you're $1 over budget, it's an execution failure. If it doesn't quite have all the quality needed initially, but even if you still update it later, that's an execution failure. So, that said, you and I probably wouldn't consider any sort of going over that small of an amount to be a failure. Yet, definitionally, that's why we see that failure rate as high as 90%. That's saying only 10% of IT projects are successful. And successful means there that the project meets its original deadlines, it meets its original budget, and it meets its original scope. So that's very difficult to actually do. And that's why project management is considered a very risky job. So let's dive a little bit more into this failure and see if we can't parse out specifically what causes it. So the first problem there is ambiguity of purpose. So with ambiguity of purpose, what happens is that the goals of the project are not clearly communicated and disseminated throughout the team. And that's typically the result of poor communication. And we've talked a little bit about organizational communication with business process management earlier. We talked about how these different functional units, they don't always communicate very well. And that's pretty expected, but we want to overcome that. And a lot of that is going to come from having leadership that's able to instill and motivate people to care. They're able to share that vision for the project. So think about RIS, okay? The whole idea of RIS is that you're able to influence people to be charismatic, to be someone that people want to follow. That's the key there to having effective project management. And we think about some other ambiguity of purpose. Some of that comes down to latent needs. Okay, so latent needs are going to be needs that aren't really visible and spoken, but yet they're still there. So as the project manager, you have to essentially go up to people who are not technical. These are not, people who have a 30-year background in information technology or something like that. These are often people who have a very specific business focus. And you have to be able to communicate with them. And you have to be able to essentially elicit from those individuals what it is that the business needs are. And that can lead to a lot of ambiguity. Number 2 is something that I see a lot of students and young professionals get trapped in, and that's unnecessary complexity. It's really easy to view a project and view that as something that is going to change the world. It's going to be something that just does all of these different things, and it's going to just solve so many problems. But the more complex something is, the more opportunities there are for failure. The more opportunities there are that you have problems with quality. The more opportunities there are that it takes longer, it takes more resources. So we typically would want to avoid any sort of unnecessary complexity and make our projects as simple as possible. That's also going to have advantages for reuse and many other things as well. So with that said, we also want to factor in here hazard number 3, which is the absence of an explicit choice or trade-off. So with the absence of an explicit choice or trade-off, essentially what that means is that anytime we present an IT project or just a project in general, because I don't want you to get in the mindset of all of this has to be IT projects. Project management is applicable to any business discipline. You can have accounting projects, you can have finance projects. But the idea is that when you have projects, you're finding different solutions to problems. That is why we have projects in the first place. So what you don't want to do is just present one possible solution. You want to find maybe 3 or 4 different solutions, research them a little bit, present these different options. And the reason that this unit is included in our financial analysis is because when you're building these project plans and you're deciding on this, a lot of this comes down to financial metrics. So a lot of businesses out there have very strict guidelines and rules for what types of projects will and will not be approved. So, for example, it's very common that businesses have a break-even point of 2 years or less, which means that if a project doesn't break even in 2 years, they're not interested in it. It's also common to have a pretty high discount rate on stuff like net present value. So I mentioned in class earlier that between 10 and 15% is a pretty typical discount rate for a lot of businesses, which means that if you're not exceeding that 10 or 15% rate of return, businesses are not going to be interested in it. So that said, you want to make sure you're presenting different choices. So, speaking more generally about IT project management, it's a really tough job. And it's not just tough because of all these different guidelines and all these different possibilities for failure. It's tough because you have to have so many different skills. You need to be able to do some software development, because if you can't do any software development, if you don't understand what's involved with that, how are you going to know how long it takes to do something? How are you going to know different ways of doing something? You're not. You need to be aware of budgeting. You need to be aware of time management. You need to be able to work with people. I would go so far as to say that IT project management, the people skills are the most important part. Because as a project manager, one of the biggest challenges you have is the fact that you have employees who you aren't responsible for. You don't sign their paychecks. You don't get to tell them what to do, but you have to still motivate them. So think about that for a minute. To have to motivate someone with whom you don't have the authority to fire. In other words, you can't just say, hey, if you don't do this, I'm going to fire you. That's not an option here. And that presents a lot of challenges. So I don't want you to think of project management as being all doom and gloom. Let's think about some of the failures a little bit more, though. So I mentioned briefly that we have any potential for failure can come from being 1 second past schedule, 1 penny over budget, and not doing one function that's asked originally. And that's true, but let's break down why that is. So essentially, we have this idea of the triple constraint. And what the triple constraint typically tells us is that we can maximize any 2 of these. So for instance, if we want to maximize both time and cost, the scope of the project, in other words, what the project does, is going to be limited. It's not going to be a very ambitious scope. It's not going to do a lot of new and novel things. If we say, okay, I want it to do some new and novel things and I want it done really quickly, well, that's going to be expensive. And then we could also say, well, I want it done cheaply and I want it to do a lot. I want it to have a really ambitious scope, then the time is going to suffer. So we have to balance those 3 aspects. So let's talk about that scope a little bit more. So within the scope, there are 3 different terms that you need to be aware of. So the first is going to be the most common issue with scope, and that's called scope creep. So what happens with scope creep is that over time, what was originally agreed to in the project's scope, little things get added to it here and there. And that becomes a problem because when you add little bits over time, that's going to add up to a lot of extra work that was not originally accounted for. Now the second problem is scope leap. And scope leap is related to scope creep, but it's a little bit different because unlike a gradual addition, this is a sudden, really severe addition of all sorts of different things to the project. And then lastly, you have scope grope. Now look, I'm not going to lie to you, that's a pretty weird term to use here. It's not something I came up with. It's not something I would really go around talking about all day. But what scope grope is it's when the scope is so ambiguous that people working on the project don't know what the project is about. And that's a pretty severe problem to have, and it's definitely one that you'd want to avoid. And you do that, like we mentioned, with good communication. So, I'm going to mention some of these different methodologies for software development. So this isn't necessarily specific to an IT project in general, but just software development. So the first is going to be the software development lifecycle. What happens with software development lifecycle is we go through these different phases, and the idea is that once we've gone around all of the phases, as long as we have gone through them all, Once we have completed that, we can go from one phase to any other phase. So if we, for example, wanted to go, we start on planning, go to analysis, design, implementation, testing, and then maintenance. Once we've done all 6 of those, we can jump back to any of these. We can jump back to design. We can jump back to testing and integration. And that's one of the cool things about the systems development lifecycle. Now, systems development lifecycle is not the only approach that we have to software development. A new term that's not really that new, actually. It's probably been around for commonplace over 20 years now. But it's agile software development. So when we talked about systems development lifecycle, each of those phases, the design is of an overall project. With an agile software development, we're not limited to using one single phase for the design of the whole project. Instead, the key with agile software development is that this is going to be a very iterative process. This is a process that we iterate over time. And in that way, we're making little bits of the project at a time and going ahead and publishing them. And that works really well in environments where, maybe testing is a little bit less critical and you can kind of test in real time. But you probably would want to avoid that for particularly sensitive environments like finance or healthcare industries where, small mistakes can be huge consequences. Now, they're not the only 2 options either. We also have the waterfall methodology. Waterfall is pretty similar to systems development lifecycle, but the difference is that it's a waterfall. With a waterfall, you don't go back up. You don't go jump from 1 to step 6. Okay, you have to go all the way down the waterfall. I mean, you've probably heard the phrase, stuff doesn't run uphill. And that's definitely true of the waterfall methodology. But you can see there with agile methodology, you can see that you can jump from little step to little step. So there's a lot of different flexibilities. So you kind of have to pick which approach works best for you. Now, I hope I didn't lose anyone there talking about different software development life cycles and different ways of developing software. I know software development's not for everyone. That's totally fine. But these documents I'm about to talk about, they are for everyone. Okay, these documents that we're going to be discussing, they apply to any project, be it an IT project or a management project or a finance project. It doesn't matter. These are all going to apply. So those are going to be the project charter, the work breakdown structure, and the project schedule. So starting with the project charter, this is going to be the document that does several important things for us. So in the basic sense, the project charter is the document that is going to be used to get key support for the project and to actually initiate the project. So this is where we're going to define the project's name. Okay, we're going to define what the project's goal is. What is its scope? What is the major purpose behind this project? What value does it provide the organization? What are some of the key resources this project is going to be using? It's going to also set out the roles and responsibilities. It's going to name the different departments and people who are going to be working on the project. It's going to really get executive top-level support for the project. So this is a vital document to have because without this document, you don't really have much of a project. Okay, top-level executive support, that is vital to any project's success in an environment. So that's definitely something that we want to have done very well. There's also going to be some elements of risk analysis inside of a project charter. Analyzing what are the risks of failure, what are the risks of success, the sort of financial metrics. These are going to be preliminary. They're not going to be exact, but this goal here is going to be analyzed to tell whether or not this project should get funding, whether or not this project should get support. So this is a very important document to have. So here's a little outline of what a project charter might look like. You can see the different parts of it. It's got the title, manager, it's got who the project is for, start date, end date, justification, constraints, and all sorts of other things. So, don't look at that document there and say that's exactly what every project charter looks like. But that's what a typical project charter might look like. Okay, so the formatting might differ a little bit, the colors, the fonts. That's not important. What's important is the information that is there. So now we'll talk about the work breakdown structure. So the work breakdown structure, as the name would imply, breaks down a task into many different subtasks. And work breakdown structures are what you're going to be making for your business. You're going to be picking some sort of project and you're going to be making a work breakdown structure for it. Now, like the other projects we have in this class, you're not really graded on accuracy. Okay, this class is not supposed to be ridiculously hard or anything like that. It's supposed to be a class to kind of guide you toward learning about different business diagrams and that sort of thing. So on that project that you're going to be working on, the work breakdown structure, as long as you meet the minimum requirements, that's what you're graded on there. So essentially, this is a hierarchical chart, which means that the order matters immensely. So we start at the general task, and then we break it into as many subtasks as we can, sort of like a tree or an outline diagram. So here we go. So what we have here is a work breakdown structure where we have our project, and we have the number of hours and the budget. And then we break that down into requirement specification, design specification, and software. And then we break down each of those subtasks into more subtasks. So for requirement specification, we've got 3 separate tasks for that. Design specification, we have 3, and then software, we have 2. Now notice here how this hierarchy works. So we have the overall task is going to be task number 1.0. And then we break that task into subtask 1.1. We break 1.1 into 1.1.1, 1.1.2, 1.1.3. And we do that for each of the subtasks. We break them down so that each additional layer we go, we're essentially moving 1 additional decimal point. So the first layer is going to be 1 decimal point, second is going to be 2, third is going to be 3, and so forth. So take a look at that diagram there. I think that should really help you solidify what that means. So here's a work breakdown structure that'll look pretty similar to what you'll end up doing. So you see the task 1, the overall software project, which is broken down into project management, task 1.1, technical design 1.2, testing 1.3, and then training 1.4. And then we broke project management into 8 subtasks, 1.1.1 through 1.1.8, and so forth. So when you take a look at that, I think that'll help solidify it. This is another work breakdown structure. You can look at that one in a little bit more detail if you want. But I want to kind of make sure that we have these sort of rules and procedures kind of in place. So you develop a work breakdown structure. You start off by naming and numbering the project. And then like we mentioned, you're going to break that project into major phases. Okay, so that's going to be where you have your .1, .2, .3, and so forth. And then you're going to break those major phases into different subtasks and activities. Okay? And you keep going with that as long as it's logical to do so. Okay? So let's say we wanted to make a work breakdown structure for throwing a party. So task 1 is going to be we're going to throw a party. And we think about what those subtasks for that are going to be. So we might have a subtask for invite guests as 1.1. Subtask for prepare for the party for 1.2. Subtask for throw the party for 1.3. And then a subtask for clean up for 1.4. So then for each of those, we're going to break those down a little bit further. For invite guests, we're going to say make a guest list in 1.1.1, email the invitees in 1.1.2, compile responses. I kind of get the idea there. Prepare for the party. Buy beverages 1.2.1, buy food 1.2.2, and so forth. So you see the throw the party there inside of 1.3.1. You can tell I didn't make this because it says watch the door. I would say have a good time. Okay, you can kind of read between the lines there for what that might mean for you. But don't just sit there and watch a door at a party. That's not any cool at all. Okay. And then ultimately you can see you're going to clean up. You kind of see the task. You take the cleanup 1.4, break it down into garbage collection 1.4.1, vacuum 1.4.2, bathroom cleaning 1.4.3, kitchen cleaning 1.4.4. So that's pretty much what you're going to be doing for your work breakdown structure. You can break that down further if you need to. Generally, that's not really needed. So what you're going to be doing for your work breakdown structure is you're going to be thinking about the business you've been working with up to this point. And for that business that you've been working with, what you want to do is think about some project. It could be developing the app, for example. But it could be something else, okay? So, if you decide to do the task of developing the app and bring it to market, think about what's going to happen. So you might have user research as 1.1, software development as 1.2, testing as 1.3, maybe deployment as 1.4. That's just an example. So then you're going to build that work breakdown structure for that 3-step process. So you need to have essentially, at minimum, 3 levels and 3 sub-levels. Okay. Now you can use any software that you want to do that. I think Microsoft Word, you can pretty easily put some boxes on a page and connect them with an arrow. You can use other software online that's available. There's a lot of options for that. I know a lot of people like to use Draw.io. But ultimately, just make sure that you turn this in individually and you'll be at a great spot. So I hope that was helpful. Sorry again, I couldn't lecture in person. Just not really feeling 100% right now, so I apologize for that. However, I do hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next one.